On the morning of his death, a man named Thomas Greer was given a choice that no court in Europe would ever have offered him. He stood on the beach of Isle Sainte-Marie, a hooked sliver of land off the eastern coast of Madagascar in the spring of 1716. Behind him, a rope hung from the limb of a tamarind tree. In front of him, pulled up onto the white sand, sat a small open boat with a single oar, a stoppered jug of water, and a pistol loaded with one shot. The crew had voted. Greer could take the rope, or he could take the boat and the open ocean, and whatever the sea decided to do with him. He looked at the boat for a long time, then he asked for the rope. The men who watched him did not jeer. They did not laugh. They understood exactly what he was choosing and exactly what he was refusing, because every one of them had stood close enough to that boat at one time or another to feel the cold coming off it. Thomas Greer chose to die in an hour, by a method he could see and understand, rather than to live for 3 more weeks as something the sea would slowly take apart. Before they hanged him, the quartermaster opened a battered ledger bound in black oilcloth, found the line that carried Greer's name and drew a single stroke through it. That stroke, more than the rope, was the real sentence. And the question that should haunt you is this: why would a hardened man, a thief and a killer who feared almost nothing, look at a chance to live and turn it down for a certainty of death? The answer is written in that black book, and the answer is not what you think. For 300 years we have been told that pirate punishment meant one thing: cruelty. The plank, the lash, the cutlass and the keel. We picture a grinning brute forcing some poor sailor to walk blindfolded off a board into shark-thick water, and we file pirates away under the heading of mindless savagery and move on. But the truth is far stranger and far more uncomfortable. The bloody physical punishments that fill our films and our storybooks were, in the world of the real pirate, very close to mercy. They were quick. They were public. They were governed by rules and votes and written articles, and a great many men survived them and went on living, scarred but whole. The penalty that every pirate in the Indian Ocean genuinely dreaded, the one that emptied the blood from a grown man's face, left no mark on the body at all. It was a single line drawn through a name in a book. Hollywood sold us the whip. The real terror was the ink. To understand why, you have to leave the Caribbean entirely. Forget Port Royal and Nassau and the warm green waters of the Spanish Main. The story of the harshest and most refined pirate justice unfolds on the other side of the world, in the long hot reaches of the Indian Ocean, during the years that sailors called the pirate round. From roughly 1690 to 1720, ships crewed by Englishmen and Scots and Frenchmen, and escaped slaves and deserters from a dozen navies crossed the Atlantic, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and hunted the richest prey on earth. The treasure ships of the Mughal Empire, bound between Surat and the holy ports of the Red Sea, their holds packed with gold, silver, silk, and pilgrims' tribute. The hunters made their nests on Isle Sainte-Marie, on the Comoros island the sailors called Johanna, and along the narrow strait of Bab el-Mandeb where the Red Sea pours into the ocean. It was here, far from any king's reach, that pirate law grew its sharpest teeth. And here is the first thing the films get wrong. The man who held the power of punishment on a pirate ship was almost never the captain. The captain led in the chase and in the fight, and the moment the fight was over his authority shrank back down to the size of any other man's. The man who carried the law in his hands was the quartermaster, and he was elected. The crew chose him, the crew could remove him, and it was his job to stand between the captain and the men so that no single tyrant could ever do to them what their old naval officers had done. He distributed the food and the plunder. He settled the daily quarrels. And when a man broke the articles, it was the quartermaster who read the charge, the quartermaster who counted the votes, and the quartermaster who kept the black log. On St. Marie in those years, there was a quartermaster named Daniel Marsh, a former Bristol cooper with a flat northern voice and a memory like a steel trap, and almost everything we understand about how this justice worked in practice, we owe to the records men like him left behind. Now let us walk through the punishments themselves, and let us do it honestly, in the order our imaginations rank them, from the fate we assume was worse to the one that actually was. Begin with the lash, because everyone begins there. A flogging on a pirate ship was a brutal thing, delivered with a knotted rope or a cat of 9 tails across a man's bared back, the count fixed by vote and carried out before the assembled crew. A common sentence ran to 30 lashes, sometimes more for a second offense. It tore the skin. It left a man feverish and scarred for life. And yet, here is the thing our imaginations refuse to hold on to. The flogged man lived. He healed. Within a month he was hauling line beside the men who had watched him bleed, and not one of them thought less of him for it, because the debt had been paid in public and the books were square. Compare that to the Royal Navy of the very same decade, where a captain could order 300 lashes on his own private whim for an offense as small as a sullen look, where a man could be flogged unconscious and then revived and flogged again, and where the punishment carried no vote, no defense, and no end to the shame. The pirate's lash was savage, but it was bounded, and it was earned, and it was over. Move up the ladder to keel hauling, the punishment whose very name still makes us wince. The condemned man was bound with ropes passed beneath the hull, then dragged down one side of the ship, under the keel, and up the other, scraped the whole way by the razor crust of barnacles that grew on the bottom of any vessel that had been long at sea. It was a terrible thing, and it killed men, by drowning or by blood loss or by the simple shock of it. But notice what the records actually show. Keel hauling was rare. It was reserved for the gravest betrayals, and even then it had to clear a vote, and even then the quartermaster could and often did argue it down to something a man could survive. The point was never the cruelty. The cruelty was a tool, and pirates understood, far better than the empires hunting them, that a tool used too often loses its edge. A crew that watched its members keel-hauled every week would not stay a crew for long. It would become a powder keg, and the next thing dragged under the keel would be the captain. There was a punishment the men called the sweat, a strange and almost theatrical thing, in which the condemned man was made to run in a circle around the mainmast between a ring of crewmen who pricked him with the points of their cutlasses and forks while a fiddler played, faster and faster until he dropped. It sounds like pure sadism, and it could be, but listen to the logic underneath it. The sweat drew blood without taking life. It humiliated without maiming. It let a furious crew burn off its rage on a man's dignity instead of his body, and at the end of it the man was still alive and still useful, and the fiddle stopped, and the work went on. Even the cruelty had a budget. And then there was marooning, the fate Thomas Greer refused on that beach, and it is here that the whole picture begins to turn. To be marooned was to be rowed to some bare scrap of sand far from any trade route, handed a jug of water, a few mouthfuls of food, and a pistol loaded with a single shot, and left. The water lasted days. The food lasted less. And the pistol, that famous single shot, was understood by every man who ever handed one over to be an act of mercy, because when the water was gone and the sun had done its work and death was coming slowly across the sand, the marooned man could choose to meet it quickly. We think of marooning as abandonment. The pirates thought of it as a sentence of death with one small kindness folded inside, and that single shot tells you everything about a culture we have been taught to imagine as having no kindness at all. The most famous marooned man of the age, a Scot named Alexander Selkirk, survived 4 impossible years on an island off Chile and came home to inspire the story of Robinson Crusoe. But Selkirk was a miracle. The ordinary marooned man, the one history did not write a book about, was dead inside a month, and the only mercy the sea allowed him fit in the chamber of a pistol. So look at what we have. The lash a man survives, the keel he might survive, the sweat he almost always survives, the marooning that kills him but kills him cleanly with a way out tucked into his hand. Every one of these punishments touched the body and left the man's name where it was, written in the log, his place in the brotherhood intact even as his back bled. And every one of them, brutal as it was easier to bear than the thing the pirates of the Indian Ocean truly feared. Because none of these touched the one thing a pirate could not live without. This was not the practice of one rogue crew. Across the whole Eastern world the same logic appeared again and again, in the hands of men who had never met one another, which is how you know it was a system and not a madness. On St. Marie, Daniel Marsh kept his black ledger and read his charges in that flat Bristol voice. 200 miles north on the island of Johanna, a quartermaster named William Tate, a Cornishman who had once been a parish clerk and never quite lost the habit, kept a log of his own, ruled into neat columns, every offense and every sentence entered in a clerk's careful hand. And out on the Red Sea routes, aboard a raider that worked the pilgrim fleets near Mocha, a freedman named Roger Selby, who had escaped a sugar plantation and taught himself letters out of pure defiance, kept a third record, and his was the strictest of them all, because a man who has been owned understands better than anyone what it means to have your name belong to someone else. 3 men, 3 islands, 3 books, no contact between them, and the same idea written in all 3. That the worst thing you could do to a pirate was not to hurt him, it was to unmake him. There was one name that recurred in all 3 records, and it was not the name of a victim. It was the name of a captain, and it was always written as a warning. We will come to him. But first we have to answer the question that any sane person asks when they look at all this careful machinery of pain. Why? Why would men who had fled the cruelty of kings and captains, men who had mutinied precisely to escape the lash, turn around and build a ranked and ruled system of punishment of their own? Why not simply live free of all of it? Because they had no choice and they knew it. Picture the problem honestly. A pirate ship in the Indian Ocean carried 60, 80, sometimes 100 armed and dangerous men, every one of them a volunteer, every one of them a thief by trade, packed into a wooden hull 100 feet long for months at a stretch, half a world away from any law on earth that could touch them. There was no admiral to appeal to. There was no court to send for. If 2 men's quarrel turned to blood, no constable was coming. If a man stole from the common chest, no magistrate would weigh it. The only thing standing between that crew and a bloodbath was a set of rules they had made themselves and agreed to enforce on one another, and the only thing that gave those rules teeth was the certainty of consequence. A punishment that came from the captain's mood was a punishment men would mutiny against, because they had mutinied against exactly that before. But a punishment that came from a vote, written in a book they could all see, applied to the high and the low alike, was a punishment they would accept because it was theirs. Proportion was not softness. Proportion was the only thing keeping the ship from tearing itself to pieces. A crew that punished too lightly invited theft and betrayal. A crew that punished too savagely invited the knife in the dark. The black log, with its ranked and measured sentences, was how desperate men held the narrow middle path between the two, and survival lived on that path and nowhere else. Which brings us at last to the captain whose name kept appearing in all 3 ledgers as a warning. He was an Englishman called Abel Thorne, and for a season around 1712 he commanded a powerful ship out of the Red Sea routes, and he was, by every account that survives, a genuinely cruel man. Not cruel in the measured way of the articles, but cruel for pleasure. Thorne ignored the log. He flogged on his own authority without a vote. He kept the sweat going long past the point of sense, until men died of it, and he laughed while the fiddle played. He tortured captured sailors from the prize ships not for information, which the rules in some crews allowed by majority vote, but for the entertainment of watching them break. And for a time it worked, the way fear always works for a time, because frightened men obey. But Abel Thorne had forgotten the one thing every successful pirate captain knew in his bones. He served at the pleasure of his crew. The breaking point came over a captured man, a young sailor pulled from a Mogul trader, an ordinary frightened boy who had done nothing but be aboard the wrong ship on the wrong morning. Thorne wanted to make a spectacle of him, the kind of slow public cruelty that had become his habit. But this time, the quartermaster, a quiet, hard man whose name comes down to us only as Edward Cole, stepped between the captain and the boy and did the one thing the articles allowed him to do. He called for a vote. He opened the black log on the deck where every man could see it, and he read aloud in front of the whole crew the article they had all signed, the one that said no prisoner was to be tortured without the consent of the company. And then he asked them, not the captain, them. Understand what this crew could have done. They were violent men. They had a frightened prisoner and a captain demanding blood, and the easy path, the path of least resistance, was simply to look away and let Thorn have his entertainment as they had let him have it before. No one would have stopped them. There was no one for 10,000 miles to stop them. They had every excuse a human being could want to choose cruelty, and they chose the book instead. The vote went against the captain. The boy was not tortured. He was put ashore unharmed at the next landfall as the article required. And the crew, having reminded themselves out loud of what they had agreed to be, took the next and harder step. They voted on Abel Thorn. They stripped him of his command, and the quartermaster opened the black log, found the captain's name, and drew the single line through it. Thorn was put off the ship, not killed, cast out. And that distinction, the difference between killing a man and erasing him, is the whole secret of this story. Because for Abel Thorn, the line through the name was the worst of the two by far, and he knew it the moment the ink touched the page. Here finally is the fate worse than death, the punishment they never put in the films because it does not photograph. To be struck from the log was to be unmade. It meant that your name, the name that entitled you to a share of every prize, to a vote in every decision, to the protection of every man aboard and the brotherhood of every crew on every island, was gone. You were not hanged. You were not marooned. You were simply no longer one of them, and the word traveled faster than any ship. A man struck from the log on St. Marie would find that the quartermaster on Johanna already knew it before his boat touched the sand, because the logs spoke to one another through every tavern and trading post in the ocean. No crew would sign him. No share would be set aside for him. The taverns that had poured his rum on credit now wanted coin. He no longer had any way to earn. The brethren who had called him brother looked through him as though the sea had already taken him. He still breathed. He still walked, but every door that had once stood open to a man with a name in a book was shut, and the ports turned him away one after another until there was nowhere left to go. This is why Thomas Greer chose the rope, not because he feared the open boat more than the noose, but because he had already been struck from the log, and he understood that the boat would not return him to the sea he loved. It would return him to nothing. The men of the Brotherhood, in their cruelty, had also given the worst treated among them a strange dignity, the dignity of choosing how to leave a world that had already cast them out. And the men who watched him did not laugh, because every one of them knew that the rope was the kinder of his two roads, and that the unkind one had been traveled long before he ever reached that beach. The age that built these books could not last, and it did not. By the closing years of the pirate round, the Mogul emperor had grown tired of his treasure fleets being gutted, and he leaned hard on the European trading companies whose forts dotted the Indian coast, and the companies, terrified of losing their licenses, turned on the pirates who had once sheltered in their shadow. Warships came east in numbers. The pardons came too, the king's mercy offered to any man who would lay down and come home, and one by one the great crews took it or were hunted down. Isle St. Marie emptied. The careened hulks rotted in the shallows. The taverns closed. And the black logs, those strange and meticulous books in which murderers had kept honest accounts of one another, were lost almost to the last. Some were burned by men who wanted no record of what they had been. Some went down with the ships. A bare handful survived, copied out by colonial clerks during the trials that ended the age, and it is from those few captured pages, preserved now in archives in London and in the old company towns, that we know any of this happened at all. When a crew scattered, its law died with it because that law had never lived in stone or statute. It had lived in a book and in the memory of the men who kept it, and when they were gone, it was gone. But the idea did not die, and this is where the story turns one last time and shows you what it was really about. We have been taught that the worst thing one human being can do to another is to hurt the body, and the pirates of the Indian Ocean knew something we have half forgotten. The body heals. The back that takes 30 lashes is whole again in a season. The thing that does not heal, the wound that has no bottom, is to be cut out of the community of your fellows and made to walk among them as a ghost. These were the most dangerous and least sentimental men of their age, killers who had abandoned every law that ever bound them, and even they, given the freedom to invent any punishment they could dream up, discovered that the deepest terror they could hold over one another was not pain or even death. It was exile. It was the erasure of a name. It was the loss of belonging. And once you see that, you start to see it everywhere, long after the last pirate took the king's pardon and walked inland to disappear. The army that strips the disgraced soldier of his rank and his colors and drums him out the gate. The court that does not merely fine or jail a man but disbars him, strikes him from the roll, ends his standing among his peers. The town that shuns. The institution that expels and erases the record. Every one of these is the same instinct the quartermasters wrote into their black books 300 years ago, the recognition that human beings are bound to one another by belonging, and that to remove a person from that web is to reach a place deeper than the body and do a harm the lash never could. The pirates did not invent this. But in their lawless havens, with no king to imitate and no court to copy, free to be as savage as they pleased, they found it on their own, which tells you it is not a rule that civilization teaches us. It is something truer than civilization, something we reach for whenever the ordinary punishments run out. So the next time you picture a pirate, do not picture the plank. Picture a quiet man in a hot cabin on an island off Madagascar, opening a book bound in black oilcloth, running his finger down a column of names. And stopping at one. Picture the pen. Picture the single line. That line was the most feared thing in an ocean full of cannon and cutlass and storm, and it was feared not because it killed, but because it took away the only thing those hard and homeless men had left, which was each other. They were thieves and murderers, and they built a world on blood. But they proved, without meaning to, that even at the very bottom of the human story, below the law and below the king and below mercy itself, a man will choose death by the rope over a life without his people. That is the fate worse than death they never taught you. Not the lash, not the keel, just a name and a line and the silence of every door that used to open. If you want more stories about the strange rules and stranger justice that real history buried and the textbooks left out, this is part of a whole series on the hidden codes of the outcasts and the outlaws who lived beyond the edge of the map. Subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.